The land office in Cedar Home had 2 locks on its front door, and Otis Pemberton was turning both of them when the 6 riders came up the muddy street with their collars raised against the rain and their rifles laid loose across their saddle bows. "That's far enough," Pemberton called out, though his voice cracked on the last word and gave away how little far enough would matter to men like these. Rain had fallen for 19 days straight over the Tailless Valley, turning the road into a brown river of its own, and the man at the front of the riders sat his horse like the weather did not touch him at all. Silas Voss wore a good coat and a clean hat, and he smiled the way men smile when they already know how a thing will end. "We are not here for trouble, Mr. Pemberton," Voss said. "We are here for a look at your books, specifically the entry filed in the spring of 1883 for the northeast quarter along the Tailless River, the Bell Claim. Land office records are not for public handling outside of posted hours," Pemberton said, though his hand was shaking as he said it, and the key was still in the lock instead of turned all the way home. "There is also," Voss went on as though the clerk had not spoken at all, "a witness signature on that filing, a man by the name of Slater, Reuben Slater. I would like to see that signature for myself before this valley goes to court over who owns what." Pemberton's mouth went dry. He knew the name. Everyone in Cedar Home knew the name by now, because a drifting cowhand who kept to himself and worked hard and never raised his voice was the kind of thing a small town noticed, turned over in its hands like a coin from a foreign country, and eventually decided it liked. He also knew, because gossip traveled faster than any of the washed-out roads, that there were older stories clinging to that name from somewhere else, stories that a land company with money to spend might dig up and use like a knife. "I do not have authority to open that file to armed men," Pemberton said, and this time his voice held. Voss's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went flat and patient, the look of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted by the simple application of enough pressure. "Then I will come back with a court order and less patience," he said. "Tell the Widow Bell that Harlan Crane's company sends its regards, and that the Cascade Land Company does not intend to let one flooded season stand between it and a valley that was never properly recorded in the first place. Tell her the paper trail runs both ways, Mr. Pemberton. Ours is older than hers." He turned his horse, and the 5 men behind him turned with him, and they rode back down the muddy street the way they had come, unhurried, the way men ride when they believe time belongs to them. Pemberton locked the second lock with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and then he went around the back of the building, saddled his own tired mare, and rode 12 miles through the rain to warn a woman he had never spoken more than a dozen words to in his life, because it seemed to him, standing in that doorway with rifles pointed loosely his direction, that some things mattered more than a man's ordinary caution. Evelyn Bell was up to her elbows in a birthing heifer when Pemberton's mare came sliding into her yard, and she did not stop what she was doing to greet him. "You will want to wait until I am done with this," she said, not looking up, "unless the barn is on fire, in which case you can start hauling water." "Mrs. Bell, I have news that will not improve with waiting," Pemberton said. But he waited anyway, standing in the rain at the rail of the pen, while Evelyn worked her hands and murmured low words to the straining animal, patient as if the whole world were only this one heifer, and this one calf and nothing else existed to trouble her. When the calf came sliding out slick and shivering onto the straw and the heifer twisted around to lick it clean, Evelyn Bell finally stood up, wiped her arms on her apron, and looked at the clerk with an attention that made him feel, for just a moment, like the most important man in the territory. "Now," she said, "tell me." She was 29 years old, tall for a woman, with dark hair that had come half loose from its pins and hands that had done 5 years of a man's work, because there had not been any other way to keep the homestead once Thomas Bell went into the river. She listened to Pemberton's account of the land office without interrupting, her face going still and careful, the way it did whenever something threatened the only thing she had left of her husband besides his name on a headstone in the little cemetery above the mill. "They cannot simply declare the filing invalid," she said when he had finished. "I have the certificate. I have 5 years of proof, Mr. Pemberton. I built that cabin with my own hands after Thomas died. I have planted every acre they require me to plant. The final proof hearing is not until autumn, but I have done everything the law asks of me. They are saying the original filing itself was improper, that the witness signature was never legally binding because the man who signed it was not, at the time, a citizen in good standing under the law." Pemberton's face colored with the shame of having to say such a thing to her. "They mean Mr. Slater's past, Mrs. Bell. Whatever it is. I do not know the particulars myself, only that Voss went looking for them, and men who go looking for particulars like that generally find enough to make trouble with, whether the trouble is fair or not." Evelyn had gone very still. She was thinking, though she did not yet say it aloud, of the exact spring morning 5 years past when a lean, quiet stranger passing through the valley on his way to nowhere in particular had stopped to help a young couple raise a cabin wall too heavy for 2 pairs of hands, had stayed 3 days out of simple decency, and had signed his name as a witness to their homestead filing because the law required 2, and there had been no one else within 20 miles. She remembered Thomas laughing that the stranger worked like a man running from something. She had not known then how close to true that was, nor how little it would matter to her once she came to know the man himself, years later, when he rode back into the valley on his way to becoming someone entirely different. "Reuben did not do anything wrong by witnessing that filing," she said finally. "Whatever he did or did not do before he came here is his business and the law's, and it was settled long before he ever put his name to my husband's paper. If Voss thinks he can unmake 5 years of my life with an old rumor, he does not know me very well." "No, ma'am," Pemberton agreed. "I do not imagine he does." Rain had been falling on the Talus Valley for the better part of a month, the kind of steady cascade rain that did not storm so much as simply persist, filling the roads with mud axle-deep and swelling every creek into something closer to a river, and every river into something closer to a flood. It had cut the valley off from Ellisport, the county seat 40 miles south, where the district land office kept its final books, and where, come autumn, a hearing officer would sit in judgment over which claims in the Talus Valley were sound and which were not. Mail had not come through in 11 days. The telegraph line to Ellisport had gone down in a slide above Cedar Home, and no one had yet found the will or the daylight to climb up and fix it. It was into this isolation, this valley cut loose from the rest of the world by weather and water, that the Cascade Land Company had chosen to make its move, and Evelyn Bell understood, standing in her own yard with a newborn calf steaming in the rain behind her. That isolation was exactly the point. A company that wanted to seize a valley did not do it in daylight with witnesses close at hand. It did it in the wet, quiet weeks when no one could ride out for help, and no judge could be reached, and every homesteader was alone with their fear, and their mud, and their failing patience. She had lost Thomas to that same river 2 years before, trying to cross it in flood to fetch a doctor for a fever that turned out, in the end, to be nothing that any doctor could have cured in time. She had buried him without ever quite forgiving the water for taking him, and she had stayed on the land anyway, alone, because leaving would have meant that his death, and her own 2 years of grief and labor, had purchased nothing at all. She was not about to let a man in a clean coat take it from her with a piece of forged paper. Reuben Slater had been in the Talus Valley 8 months, working for Amos Whitfield on the ranch 2 miles upriver from the Bell place, and in that time he had built himself a reputation the way a man builds a fence, one careful post at a time. He did not drink in the Cedar Home saloon past a single glass. He did not raise his voice to horses or men. He worked from before light until well after dark without complaint, and when Amos Whitfield's youngest boy had gone missing in a snowstorm the previous winter, It was Reuben who had gone out alone into the dark and found him, half frozen under a deadfall, and carried him home on his own back 4 miles through drifts that came up past his knees. The valley had decided, on the strength of things like that whatever quiet weight the man carried behind his eyes was his own business. He had not told anyone the particulars, and he did not intend to. There had been a younger man once, years back in the Nevada territory, who had ridden with bad company and taken part in a stagecoach robbery that had gone wrong enough to put him behind bars for 3 years and put a fear into him that he had never quite lost since, a fear of himself, of what he had been capable of becoming. He had served his time. He had walked out of that prison with nothing but the clothes on his back and a decision, made somewhere in the long gray months of his sentence, that whatever name he carried forward into the rest of his life would belong to a different man than the one who had gone in. He had taken his mother's maiden name and gone north, and north again, until the mountains got tall and green and wet enough that a man could disappear into them entirely if he wanted to, and he had wanted to badly for a long time. Reuben Slater was not a lie exactly. It was a choice. Renewed every morning he woke up and chose, again, to be the kind of man who helped a lost boy home through the snow instead of the kind of man who had once ridden toward a stagecoach with a gun in his hand, and his heart pounding with something closer to excitement than shame. He had met Evelyn Bell for the first time on a gray morning in early May, when Amos Whitfield sent him down to the Bell place to help with a broken fence line, and he had found her up on the roof of her own barn reshingling it in a light rain, because she said she was not about to wait for a man's schedule when her own hands worked well enough. "You are going to fall and break your neck," he had told her, standing below with his hat already soaked through. "I have not fallen yet in 5 years," she had said, not looking down. "Are you going to hand me shingles or stand there and worry at me?" He had climbed up and handed her shingles, and worked beside her until the light went, and he had thought, riding home in the dark afterward, that he had not felt so entirely at ease in another person's company since before Nevada, since before the name Reuben Cole had become something he had to leave folded up and buried behind him like a coat he could no longer wear. He did not know, yet, that Silas Voss had already begun asking around Cedar Home about a drifter who had come up from the south a few years back, or that the answer to those questions was going to arrive on his own doorstep faster than either he or Evelyn Bell could prepare for it. She rode to Whitfield's ranch herself the next morning, through rain that had eased to a fine gray mist, and found Reuben in the barn currying a gelding with slow, even strokes, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. "They are going to use your past against my claim," she said. "Voss came to the land office yesterday asking about your witness signature. He means to say the filing was never valid because you signed it." Reuben's hand stilled on the horse's flank. For a long moment he did not say anything at all, and Evelyn watched something pass over his face that she had not seen there before, something like a door closing, or perhaps a very old door being forced open against its will. "They will have found the Nevada business," he said, finally quiet. "I do not care what they found," Evelyn said, and she meant it plainly enough that he looked up at her, surprised. "I care that they mean to use it to take my land, Reuben. Whatever you did 15 years ago in Nevada is between you and whatever court settled it. What matters to me right now is whether you are willing to help me stop a land company from stealing a valley." He studied her for a long moment, rain dripping steadily off the barn eaves behind him, and something in his chest loosened that had been clenched tight for 8 months, maybe longer than that, maybe since the day he walked out of that prison, and decided he would never again let anyone close enough to ask him hard questions. "I signed that filing because your husband needed a witness and I was passing through, and it seemed a small enough thing to do for 2 people building something honest," he said. "I would sign it again tomorrow, and I am not going to let a man like Voss turn a kindness I did 5 years ago into the reason you lose everything you have built since." He set down the curry comb. "Tell me what you need." I need to get 80 head of cattle to Ellisport before the land office hearing, to sell for the money to fight this properly in court, and I need to carry my original certificate and every piece of proof I have straight to the district land office before Voss's company files whatever forged deed they mean to file. The roads are drowned. The only way through is the trail along the talus, and that means crossing the river itself, which has not been safely crossable in 3 weeks. Then we had better start gathering men, Reuben said. We had better start gathering cattle, Evelyn said. The men will follow once they see it can be done. Gathering the men proved harder than gathering the cattle. Amos Whitfield agreed at once, glad of an excuse to strike back at a company that had been sending riders past his own fences at night for a month, cutting wire and scattering stock, and leaving no one to blame directly for any of it. 2 more homesteaders from up the valley, a widower named Casper Doyle with a grown son called Charlie, and an older bachelor everyone called Big Ned Calloway, agreed to throw in their own smaller herds for the joint drive, on the theory that 80 head traveling together stood a better chance against flood, and against the company's hired riders than any of their smaller herds traveling alone. It was Big Ned who argued loudest against Reuben's presence from the very first night they gathered at the Bell Place to plan the route. I have heard what they are saying about him in town, Ned said, standing by the fire with his thumbs hooked in his belt, not quite looking at Reuben directly. A man with a prison record and a false name is not a man I want riding drag on a drive with my cattle mixed into the herd. No offense meant to you personally, Slater. None taken, Reuben said, evenly. You are entitled to your caution. I would only ask you judge me on what I do on this drive, not on what Voss's men whisper about what I did somewhere else a long time ago. That is fair enough, Amos Whitfield put in before Ned could argue further. I have worked beside this man 8 months. He found my boy in a blizzard when I could not find my own hand in front of my face. I will vouch for him with my own herd, Ned, and that ought to count for something. Evelyn said nothing at first, letting the men argue it out among themselves the way men like to, but when Ned Calloway looked to her at last as though her word might settle it, she gave it plainly. Reuben Slater rides with this drive, she said, or I take my own 80 head alone, and you can explain to the rest of the valley why you let pride keep 4 ranches from standing together against a land company that means to rob every one of us blind. Your choice, Ned. Ned Calloway grumbled, but he did not argue further, and that was the end of it. 3 nights before the drive was set to leave, someone rode through the Bell Place after midnight and put a torch to the hay barn, and Reuben was the one who woke first, smelling smoke through the cracks of the bunkhouse where he had taken to sleeping since the trouble started, close enough to help if help was needed. He roused Evelyn and the hired hands, and together they fought the fire back before it could spread to the main barn where the winter's grain was stored, working in the rain that had, for once, done them a favor by keeping the old timbers too wet to fully catch. In the gray light afterward, soot-streaked and soaked through, Evelyn found a boot print in the mud by the fence line that did not belong to any of her own people, and Reuben knelt beside it a long moment, frowning. "Company men wear town boots," he said. "This is a riding boot, worn down hard on the outside heel, a man who has spent a long time in the saddle." He looked up at her. "Voss is not sending drunks to scare us off, Evelyn. He is sending men who know what they are doing." It was the first time he had used her given name instead of Mrs. Bell, and she noticed it and did not mind it at all. "Then we had better know what we are doing too," she said. They left at first light 2 mornings later. 4 small herds combined into one long brown and white river of cattle moving south along the muddy trail that followed the talus, with Evelyn and Reuben riding point together, Amos Whitfield and Charlie Doyle working the flanks, Casper Doyle and Big Ned Calloway riding drag through the worst of the mud, and the noise of 80-some head of unhappy, rain-soaked cattle. It was slow going from the very first hour. The trail had washed out in 3 places, forcing detours through timber where low branches soaked through with 3 weeks of rain dumped cold water down every collar the moment a rider brushed past. And the cattle, footsore and skittish, balked at every crossing of the smaller feeder creeks that fed into the talus. At night they made camp under whatever shelter the timber offered, and it was there, over small fires that smoked more than they warmed, that Evelyn Bell and Reuben Slater began to become something to each other beyond trail companions. "You handle a rope better than any hired man I have ever watched," she told him on the third night, watching him coil his lariat by firelight with the easy economy of long practice. "Where does a Nevada man learn to work cattle that well?" He was quiet a moment, turning the rope over in his hands. "My father ran a small outfit outside Ely before he lost it to drink and bad luck when I was 16. I learned roping and riding before I learned much else. It was about the only clean thing I carried out of that house with me." He glanced at her across the fire. "You are not afraid to ask a man hard questions." "I buried a husband who never told me half of what worried him because he thought it was his job to carry it alone," Evelyn said. "I decided after that I would rather know a hard thing than wonder about it in the dark." "Ask me anything you want to know, then," Reuben said, and he meant it, and she heard that he meant it, and something warm settled in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "What happened in Nevada?" he told her. Plainly, without excuses, the whole of it. The bad company he had fallen into at 19 out of loneliness more than wickedness. The robbery that had gone wrong when a guard was struck and nearly killed, though not by Reuben's hand. The 3 years in the territorial prison at Carson City. The slow gray education in exactly what he did and did not want to become. He told her about walking out the gates with nothing, about the name he had left behind on purpose, buried under 100 miles of new country and honest work, one town after another, until the mountains here had felt green and wet and forgiving enough to finally stop running. Evelyn listened without flinching, and when he finished she said only, "You were 19 and lonely and made a bad choice, and you paid for it, and you have spent every day since trying to be a different man. That is not the same story as a man who is still dangerous, Reuben. I know the difference. My husband was gentle as a lamb and it did not stop the river from killing him. Goodness and safety are not the same thing, and neither are a mistake and a character." He looked at her for a long moment across the low fire, rain ticking steadily on the canvas lean-to above them, and something passed between them that neither one of them named aloud that night, though both of them carried it forward into the next day's ride like a warm stone kept in a pocket. On the 5th day, riding drag to relieve Charlie Doyle, one of Big Ned Calloway's men not yet accounted for among the drive's own hands, came alongside Reuben out of the timber, a lean rider with a scar through one eyebrow, and looked at him a long moment before speaking. "Cole," the rider said low, using a name Reuben had not heard spoken aloud in years. "Didn't figure to see you punching cattle in the Washington rain, of all the places a man could hide." Reuben's hand went still on his reins. "You have the wrong man," he said, "and you are riding on land you have no business on. I rode with you outside Elko, Cole. Don't tell me I have the wrong man." The rider's smile was not friendly. "Voss will pay good money to know Reuben Cole and Reuben Slater are the same fellow. Might be I'll collect it, unless you want to talk about making it worth my while to forget I ever saw you." "Get off this land," Reuben said, and something in his voice had gone flat and cold enough that the rider's smile faltered. "Before I forget how much I have learned about not settling things the old way." The rider spat, wheeled his horse, and rode back into the timber the way he had come, and Reuben sat alone in the drizzle for a long moment, his heart pounding harder than the encounter alone should have caused, because it was not the threat that frightened him. It was how close, for one brief and terrible second, he had felt the old readiness rise up in him, the old willingness to meet trouble with his fists or worse, and how hard he had had to work to push it back down. He told Evelyn that night because he had promised himself he would not carry secrets into whatever this was becoming between them, and she took his hand across the fire without a word first, and only after a moment said, "That man works for Voss, which means Voss already knows or will know within the day. We should assume the land office fight is not the only fight coming. I am sorry, Reuben said. I did not mean to bring my old troubles onto your drive. You did not bring them, Evelyn said. Voss brought them, the same way he brought forged deeds and burned my hay barn. Do not apologize to me for the things bad men do, Reuben. Save your apologies for things you actually did wrong. She squeezed his hand once firm and let it go, though neither one of them moved very far apart afterward, and they sat together in the wet dark long after the others had gone to their bedrolls, talking low about small things, easy things, the way people talk when they have decided, without saying so, that they intend to keep talking to each other for a long time to come. They reached the Talus River crossing on the 7th day and found it exactly as bad as Evelyn had feared. The ford that Thomas Bell had drowned trying to cross 2 years before lay a mile downstream from where the trail met the water now. But the river had risen so high with 3 weeks of rain that the whole valley bottom had become one wide brown sheet of moving water, studded with drowned brush, and the black shapes of uprooted trees rolling slowly downstream like something alive and hungry. The old ferry landing on the far side stood empty, its cable slack and half submerged, the ferry itself either sunk or carried off entirely. There was no sign of the ferryman. The herd bunched and bawled along the near bank, unwilling even to approach the water, and the 6 riders gathered their horses in a rough circle just back from the flood to argue, because there was nothing else useful to do until someone decided something. We wait, Big Ned Calloway said flatly. No sane man crosses a river running like that. We camp here until the water drops, however many days that takes. We do not have however many days, Ned, Amos Whitfield said. The hearing in Ellisport is set for the last day of the month, and if Voss files his forged deed before we get there with our proof, it will not matter whether our cattle are fat and healthy. It will matter that we are 3 days late to the only argument that counts. There is the toll bridge at Marsh's Crossing, Caspar Doyle offered, 12 miles upstream, sturdy timber above the flood line. The toll bridge at Marsh's Crossing is owned outright by the Cascade Land Company, Reuben said. Voss bought the concession from old Marsh himself last winter. I heard it from one of Whitfield's neighbors. Riding 12 miles out of our way to cross a bridge controlled by the very company trying to ruin us seems like walking into a trap with our eyes open. Then, what do you propose, Slater? Ned snapped. Swim 80 head of cattle across a flood that has already drowned one good man from this valley. The words landed harder than Ned perhaps intended, and Evelyn felt them like a slap, the memory of Thomas rising up cold and sudden. But she did not let her face show it, because she had learned in 2 years of running a homestead alone that grief shown at the wrong moment only handed other people power over you. Nobody is swimming 80 head across open flood water, she said, cutting through the men's raised voices before Amos or Reuben could answer Ned's challenge with heat of their own. That is how my husband died, and I am not burying anyone else in this river. But rivers do not flood evenly, gentlemen. There is always a place where the bottom holds and the current slows, if a person looks for it instead of only looking at the water, and deciding it is all the same danger. With respect, Mrs. Bell, Ned said, not quite managing to keep the doubt out of his voice, this is not shingling a barn roof. Reading river water in flood takes a lifetime of watching it. I have lived on this river 5 years, Evelyn said. I have watched it flood every spring and every hard rain since, and I watched exactly where it took my husband's horse down, and exactly where the same horse, 3 years earlier before I ever laid eyes on this valley, according to Thomas's own journal, had crossed safely a half-mile upstream at a gravel bar the old settlers called the Elk Ford, because the elk crossed there too, every autumn on their way down from the high country. Elk do not choose crossings by accident, Mr. Calloway. They choose them because the footing holds. The men fell silent. Ned Calloway looked at her for a long moment, some of the doubt going out of his face and something more like respect coming in to replace it, though he was too stubborn a man to say so directly. You know exactly where this ford is? Amos asked. I know exactly where the journal says it is, Evelyn said. I have never crossed there myself. I am going to ride up and look at it before I ask a single man here to trust his cattle to my memory of a page in a dead man's diary. I will come with you, Reuben said, already turning his horse. So will I, Amos said, but Evelyn shook her head. An horse disturbs less footing than three, and if the bank is soft, I would rather find that out myself than have 3 sets of hooves tear it apart before we know if it will hold a herd, she said. Reuben can come, because a second set of eyes never hurts, and because if my horse goes down in that current, I would like somebody near enough to pull me out. The rest of you keep the herd calm and keep watching the trail behind us. Voss's men know we are stalled here. That makes us slow-moving and easy to find. They rode upstream along the swollen bank, past drowned alder and stands of cedar dripping steadily in the endless gray light, until the trail bent away from the main channel, and the water spread wide and shallow-looking across a broad gravel bar exactly where Thomas Bell's journal, committed to memory over 2 years of grieving and rereading, had said it would be. Evelyn dismounted at the water's edge and studied it a long while in silence, reading the surface the way another person might read a face, watching where the current broke smooth and where it broke rough, where driftwood caught and held against a hidden obstruction, and where it slid past clean and unimpeded. There, she said finally, pointing to a line running diagonally across the width of the river, where the water ran fast but shallow and even, unbroken by the boils and eddies that marked deeper channels on either side. The gravel holds firm there. You can see it does not carry the same silt color as the rest. The current is faster because it is shallower, not because it is deeper. Cattle can fight a fast, shallow current far better than they can fight a slow, deep one. Reuben studied the water beside her, saying nothing for a long moment, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something between wonder and pure simple admiration. I have crossed a dozen flooded rivers in my life, he said, and I would not have seen that line if you had not shown it to me. My husband did not see it either in the end, Evelyn said, quiet. He tried the old ford in the dark, alone, in a fever of worry over a sick neighbor's child, and he never thought to look for a different crossing because he did not know one existed. I have thought about that ford every single day for 2 years, Reuben. I was not going to bring this drive within a mile of the water without being certain. You are the surest thing I have seen since I came to this valley, he said, and then, as though surprised at his own honesty, added, I mean that about the river crossing, and I mean it about more than the river crossing. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, rain beating on the brim of her hat, the gray water sliding past them both, and something settled between them that neither one hurried to break with more words. It was enough for now to have said it and to have it heard. They rode back to the herd and told the others what they had found, and though Big Ned Calloway still grumbled that he had never in his life trusted a river ford a woman found by reading a dead man's diary, he did not argue further when Evelyn mounted her horse and turned it toward the gravel bar without waiting for further debate, because there was no more time to spend arguing, and because, in the end, watching her ride toward the water with such plain, unhurried certainty had done more to convince him than any words could have. The crossing itself took the better part of 2 hours, and every ounce of skill the 6 of them possessed. Evelyn rode first, alone, walking her horse slow and steady along the exact line she had marked, letting the lead cattle see a rider they trusted go ahead of them into water that would otherwise have terrified any sane animal. Reuben rode the downstream flank, positioned to catch any animal the current pulled off the line, while Amos and Charlie pushed the herd forward from behind, and Casper and Ned worked the upstream side to keep the cattle from drifting into the deeper channel, where the water ran dark and fast. It went well for the first 60 head. Then a young steer near the back of the herd, spooked by a half-submerged branch rolling past close to its legs, bolted sideways off the line, and 3 others followed it before anyone could stop them, and all 4 went floundering into the deep channel where the current caught them at once, and began dragging them downstream toward a stand of drowned timber that would have battered them to death against submerged trunks within 100 yards. Reuben did not think. He put his horse into the deep water after them, rope already coming free from his saddle, and Evelyn, seeing him go, felt her heart lurch into her throat with a fear so sudden and total it nearly stopped her breath. The exact fear that had lived in her chest every day for 2 years since the river took Thomas, rising up now whole and terrible as she watched the man she had, without quite admitting it to herself yet, come to love, disappear into the same brown flood. Reuben. She shouted, already turning her own horse, though there was little she could do from the shallow line without abandoning the rest of the herd to the same fate. He worked fast in the deep water, roping the nearest steer and hauling its head around against the current with brutal, practiced efficiency, using the animal's own panic to drive it back toward the shallow line rather than fighting the river directly. 1 steer, 2, 3, he turned them one after another, his horse straining and half swimming in the current, until only the 4th remained, tangled now in the drowned timber itself, bawling in terror with its legs caught among submerged branches. He swung down out of the saddle into water up to his chest, holding his horse's rein in one hand and working his knife with the other, cutting the animal free of the branches that held it. And in the last moment before the current would have swept them both downstream together, he shoved the steer loose toward the shallow water and hauled himself back up into the saddle by main strength, soaked through and gasping, his horse fighting for footing on the gravel bar at last. Evelyn was there the instant he cleared the water, off her own horse before his had fully stopped moving, her hands on his arm, on his shoulder, checking him for injury with the same brisk competence she had once shown a birthing heifer, except her hands were shaking now in a way they had not been that morning. "You could have drowned," she said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way that told him, more plainly than any declaration could have, exactly how much his safety had come to matter to her. "I did not," he said, gently catching her hands in his own to still them. "Evelyn, I did not. You went into the water Thomas died in, to save 4 steers, without a moment's thought for your own life," she said, and she was angry now, angry the way people get angry when fear has nowhere else to go. "I cannot lose another man to that river, Reuben. I will not survive it a second time." "Then I will simply have to be more careful about staying alive," he said, and there was such warmth and such gentle honesty in it that her anger broke apart all at once into something closer to tears, and she let herself, finally, after 2 years of holding herself upright and alone through every hard thing the valley had asked of her, lean her forehead against his soaked shoulder for one long moment, while the rest of the herd finished crossing safely behind them. It was only after they had made camp on the far bank, the cattle bunched and settling in a hollow sheltered from the worst of the wind, that anyone noticed the gash along Evelyn's forearm, torn open by a snag of barbed brush she must have caught against without feeling it in the rush of the crossing. "You are hurt," Reuben said, catching her wrist gently as she worked at unsaddling her horse, turning her arm to the firelight. The cut was not deep, but it was long and dirty with river silt and would need cleaning before it soured. "It is nothing," Evelyn said, though she did not pull her arm away. "It is something," Reuben said, "and I intend to see to it properly, so sit down by the fire and let me, and do not argue with me the way you argue with every other man in this valley, because I have watched you win every argument you have started for a week now, and I would like, for once, to win one small argument of my own." Evelyn almost laughed, surprised into it despite the sting of the cut and the exhaustion of the crossing, and sat down on a rolled blanket by the fire as he asked. He knelt beside her and worked with a gentleness that surprised her all over again, cleaning the wound with warmed water and a clean cloth from his own saddlebag, his hands sure and unhurried despite the cold and the dark and the long hard day behind them. And he did not once treat her as though she were fragile, did not fuss or hover, only worked with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, occasionally glancing up to ask if he had hurt her, adjusting his grip when she winced, but never once suggesting that she should have been more careful, or that the injury was anything other than the ordinary cost of a hard day's honest work. "You have gentle hands for a man who spent 3 years in a prison learning to be hard," Evelyn said, watching him work. "Prison did not teach me to be hard," Reuben said, not looking up from her arm. "It taught me how much I did not want to be. There is a difference between a man who has never been tested and a man who has been tested and chosen every day since to be gentle anyway. I would rather be the second kind." "I think you already are," Evelyn said, quiet, and when he finished binding the cut and finally looked up at her, their faces closed together in the firelight. Neither one of them moved away for a long moment, and something passed between them that felt at last like a door standing open rather than closed. "Evelyn," he said low, "I do not have much to offer you. A hired hand's wages and a name I built for myself out of nothing, and a past I cannot ever fully leave behind, no matter how far north I ride." "I did not ask you what you have to offer," she said. "I asked you to help me save a valley. Everything else, Reuben, I intend to work out for myself in my own time, the same way I work out everything else." But she did not pull away when he reached up slowly and brushed a strand of wet hair back from her face. And she did not pull away either when he leaned in and kissed her, careful and searching, by a fire on the far bank of the river that had once taken everything from her and had, tonight, instead given something back. They might have stayed longer in that fragile new warmth if Charlie Doyle had not come pounding into camp an hour later on a horse blown hard from a 12-mile ride, with news that broke the moment open like a dropped plate. "Riders came through Cedar home this afternoon," Charlie said, breathless, having ridden ahead from a neighboring ranch where word had reached him by relay from a passing freighter. "Voss has moved the hearing up. They are saying in town that the company found a hearing officer in Ellisport willing to record the deed transfer this coming Thursday instead of waiting for the end of the month, on account of, and I am only repeating what I heard, on account of the valley being in a state of lawlessness and abandonment due to the flood, which they mean to use as an excuse to say nobody with a legitimate claim was left to contest it." "Thursday," Evelyn said, and did the arithmetic in her head at once, cold and fast. "Today is Sunday. Even riding hard, we cannot get the whole herd to Ellisport and still reach the land office before Thursday morning." "Then we do not take the whole herd," Reuben said. "The herd was always meant to raise money for a fight we can have another day if we lose this one. The proof of the original claim is what stops Voss from filing that forged deed at all. We split the party. Amos and Ned and the Doyles take the herd onto Ellisport at their own pace and sell what they can. You and I ride ahead tonight with your certificate and whatever proof we have, and we go by the mountain trail instead of the river road because it is shorter even if it is harder." "The mountain trail runs through Widow's Canyon," Amos Whitfield said, frowning, having come up to hear the last of it. "That is rough country, Reuben. Voss's men know the low roads. They may not know the canyon trail at all, which cuts both ways, mind you. It is a blessing if it means they cannot follow easily, and a curse if it means we are riding blind into ground we do not fully know ourselves either." "We do not have another option," Evelyn said. "Reuben is right. The herd matters, but it does not matter as much as reaching that land office before Thursday morning does. Amos, you and Ned bring the cattle on as fast as the roads allow. Reuben and I will ride for Ellisport tonight." They left within the hour, riding by lantern light along a trail that climbed steadily out of the river valley into steeper timbered country, the rain finally beginning to thin at last into a fine, cold mist as they climbed above the worst of the valley flood. Widow's Canyon opened before them near midnight, a narrow defile between two steep rock walls where an old creek had cut down through the mountain over centuries, the trail through it barely wide enough for two horses abreast in places, echoing with the sound of their own hoofbeats and the distant rush of water somewhere below. It was near the canyon's narrowest point, with dawn still hours off and the rock walls rising black and close on either side, that the first shot rang out. Reuben had his rifle free of its scabbard before the echo finished rolling down the canyon walls, already pulling his horse hard against the rock face on the left side, shouting for Evelyn to do the same. A second shot chipped stone from the wall above them, and a third whined off somewhere behind, and in the confusion of echo and darkness, it was impossible to tell how many men were shooting or from exactly which direction, only that they were shooting from above, from somewhere up along the canyon rim where the trail did not run. "They are ahead of us," Reuben said, low and fast, "which means Voss guessed we might come this way, or that scarred rider from the drive rode ahead to warn them the moment he left us. We cannot go back the way we came, not with them holding the high ground behind us as well as ahead." "There is a game trail," Evelyn said, her voice tight but steady, straining to remember every detail of hunting trips she had taken with Thomas years before, back when the marriage was young and the mountains still felt like an adventure rather than a battlefield. "Thomas and I hunted elk through here our first autumn in the valley. There is a narrow break in the east wall, easy to miss unless you know to look for it, that climbs up out of the canyon floor onto a bench above. It is too steep and too broken for a man on horseback who does not already know it is there. If we can reach it before they see where we have gone, we can get above them instead of trapped below them." "Lead the way," Reuben said, without a moment's hesitation, and there was something in his easy trust of her judgment, even now, even with bullets cracking off stone around them, that steadied her more than any reassurance could have. She led them at a dangerous half-gallop along the canyon floor, hugging the shadow of the left wall, counting paces from a bend in the creek that she remembered from a hunting trip 6 years gone, praying her memory held true. And there, exactly where she hoped it would be, the black mouth of a narrow side ravine opened in the canyon wall, choked with brush but passable, climbing steeply up and away from the main trail. They rode into it at a scramble, horses lunging and slipping on wet stone, branches tearing at clothing and skin, and behind them the gunfire grew confused, scattered, the shooters above clearly uncertain now where their targets had gone in the dark. Reuben, riding last, twisted in his saddle to fire 2 answering shots back down the ravine mouth, not aiming to kill so much as to buy confusion and time, and it was in that moment, twisting to fire, that a bullet fired blind down the ravine from somewhere above caught him along the outside of his upper arm, a burning line of pain that made him grunt aloud and nearly lose his seat. Reuben. Evelyn had heard the grunt and turned her horse back at once, heedless of the danger, until she reached him and saw the dark stain already spreading along his sleeve and the faint gray light beginning to touch the sky above the canyon rim. "Keep moving," he said through his teeth. "It is not bad. Keep moving until we are clear, Evelyn, please." She kept moving, because he asked it of her, and because stopping in that ravine would have killed them both. But she rode close beside him the whole climb, watching him from the corner of her eye, and did not fully breathe again until the ravine opened out at last onto a broad forested bench above the canyon, well clear of the gunfire, the sound of pursuit fading behind them into the vast wet silence of the mountain timber. They rode another mile before Evelyn called a halt beside a small stream, insisting despite Reuben's protests that they stop long enough to see to his arm before the blood loss weakened him further. And this time it was her hands that worked quick and sure by the gray light of approaching dawn, cutting his sleeve away, cleaning the wound, which proved, to her enormous relief, a clean graze rather than a lodged bullet, deep enough to need binding but not deep enough to be truly dangerous. "You are shaking," Reuben said, watching her hands as she worked the bandage tight. "I am furious," Evelyn said, "at Voss and at myself for not seeing this coming, and at you a little, for twisting around to shoot instead of simply riding faster." "I was trying to protect you," he said. "I do not need protecting the way you mean it," she said, tying off the bandage with more force than strictly necessary, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "I need you alive beside me, Reuben, not thrown between me and every bullet in the territory." "That is not protection. That is a way of leaving me alone in a different manner than the river left me alone. And I have already told you I will not survive losing another man to this valley." He caught her hand before she could pull away and held it against his chest, over the steady, living beat of his own heart. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I promise you that, Evelyn Bell, on whatever is left of my honor after everything Nevada took from me and everything this valley has given back. I love you." I did not intend to say it in the middle of a mountain at dawn with a bullet wound in my arm, but I find I do not much care about good timing anymore, only about telling you the truth of it before one more hour passes. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, the gray dawn light strengthening around them, birds beginning, somewhere in the wet timber, to sing the ordinary song of an ordinary morning as though the whole world had not just tilted sideways. "I love you too," she said simply, the words coming easier than she had expected, as though they had been waiting a long while for permission to be spoken. "I have loved you since you climbed up on my barn roof in the rain and handed me shingles instead of telling me to come down. I am only sorry it took a bullet and a canyon ambush to get either of us to say so plainly." He kissed her then, careful of nothing except the simple fact of her mouth against his, and they stayed a few minutes longer beside the stream, foreheads touching, both of them laughing a little shakily, with the particular giddy relief of people who have survived something together and found, on the other side of the danger, something even better waiting. Then they mounted up and rode on, because Thursday was coming regardless of how either of their hearts felt about it, and there was still a valley to save. They reached Ellisport on Wednesday evening, exhausted, mud-streaked, Reuben's arm stiff and aching beneath its bandage but holding, and found the small county seat humming with the particular tension of a town that knew something important was about to happen within its borders. Word of the Talus Valley trouble had spread even through the flood-cut isolation, carried by freighters and travelers who had managed the roads by other routes, and there was a current of sympathy for the homesteaders running through the town's ordinary citizens that Voss's company had not, apparently, managed to entirely purchase. Otis Pemberton was there ahead of them, having ridden south himself days earlier by a longer, safer route, once he judged the situation too dangerous for waiting, and he met them at the door of the boarding house with visible relief. "The hearing is set for tomorrow morning before Land Commissioner Whitmarsh," he said. "Voss's company has filed their deed already, this very afternoon, claiming an old, unpatented survey grant that predates your husband's homestead filing by 6 years, Mrs. Bell. It is a forgery, I am nearly certain of it. The ink and the paper are wrong for a document supposedly drawn in 1877, but knowing a thing and proving it before a hearing officer are not the same task." "I have the original certificate," Evelyn said, "and Thomas's journal, which records the Elk Ford and a dozen other details about this land that no forged survey could match, because whoever drew up their fraud never set foot on the ground itself. And I have Reuben, who witnessed the filing and can testify to it firsthand." "They will attack Mr. Slater's credibility," Pemberton warned. "Voss has been open in town about the Nevada matter. He means to use it to discredit the witness signature entirely, argue that a convicted felon's signature carries no legal weight." "Then we will simply have to give the commissioner the whole truth instead of letting Voss give him half of it," Reuben said, and though his voice was steady, Evelyn could see the old fear behind his eyes, the fear of being known, fully, in front of a room full of strangers who might decide, on hearing it, that he was still the boy who had ridden toward a stagecoach outside Elko rather than the man who had carried a lost child home through a blizzard. She took his hand, there in the boarding house doorway, and did not let go. "The whole truth has never once frightened me about you," she said. "It will not frighten Commissioner Whitmarsh either if we tell it plainly and let it stand beside everything else you have done since. Trust me on this the way you trusted me at the river." "I trust you," he said. "I trust you completely." The hearing convened the next morning in Ellisport's town hall. a plain wooden building packed to its walls with homesteaders from the Talus Valley who had ridden or walked or been carried through the mud to see the matter settled, along with the ordinary curious citizens of Ellisport itself. And Silas Voss sat at the front beside a lawyer in a fine suit, looking entirely at ease, as though the outcome had already been decided in his favor before a single word of testimony was heard. Land Commissioner Whitmarsh, a heavy-set, tired-looking man with a lawyer's careful patience, called the matter to order and asked first for the company's claim to be presented, and Voss's lawyer stood and laid out the forged survey grant with a great show of confidence, arguing that the original 1883 homestead filing on the northeast quarter was void on two grounds: an improper witness whose criminal history rendered his signature legally worthless, and a prior unrecorded survey grant that superseded any homestead claim entirely. "We call Mr. Reuben Slater," the lawyer said, when it came time to attack the filing's validity, and there was a ripple of whispered interest through the packed hall as Reuben stood and made his way to the front to be sworn. "You witnessed the Bell homestead filing in 1883, the lawyer said, once Reuben was sworn. "Isn't it true, Mr. Slater, that at the time you signed that document you were traveling under an assumed identity, having served a prison sentence in the Nevada Territory under the name Reuben Cole for participation in an armed robbery?" A murmur went through the hall. Evelyn, seated in the front row beside Amos Whitfield and the Doyles, kept her eyes fixed on Reuben, willing him her steadiness the way he had given her his trust at the river crossing. "That is true," Reuben said, plainly, his voice carrying clear through the hall. "I served 3 years at Carson City for a robbery I took part in at 19 years of age, out of poor judgment and worse company. I have never denied it to anyone who asked me directly, including Mrs. Bell, including Mr. Whitfield, who employed me knowing the whole of it. I changed my name after my release not to hide from the law, which had already finished with me, but to leave behind the person I had been and try, every day since, to become someone worth being. And is it not true," the lawyer pressed, "that a man convicted of a felony has no legal standing to serve as a witness on a federal land filing?" "That is a matter for the commissioner to rule on regarding the law," Reuben said, steady. "But I would ask him to consider that I signed that document as a private citizen helping 2 young settlers raise a cabin wall and file an honest claim, 5 full years after my sentence was completed, and my rights restored under Nevada law, a fact your own company's investigators could have discovered easily enough if they had bothered to look past the part of my history that suited their purposes." Commissioner Whitmarsh leaned forward with sudden sharp interest. "Is that true, Mr. Slater? Your civil rights were formally restored?" "They were, sir, upon completion of my sentence, as is standard under territorial law," Reuben said. "I have the discharge papers in my possession, dated 1885, 2 full years before I ever signed the Bell filing." He produced a folded, worn document from his coat and offered it to the commissioner's clerk to be examined, and Voss, at the front table, went very still, his easy confidence flickering for the first time. Pemberton was called next, and testified plainly to the condition of the land office records, to Voss's armed visit demanding access to files outside posted hours, and to his own examination of the company's newly filed survey grant, which he stated, under oath, showed ink chemistry and paper stock inconsistent with a document genuinely drawn in 1877, based on his 11 years' experience handling land office paperwork of that exact period. Evelyn was called last, and she brought Thomas's journal with her to the stand, reading aloud the entries describing the Elk Ford, the boundaries of the claim as originally surveyed by her husband's own hand, using instruments he had purchased in Portland in 1882, the dated notation of the day Reuben Slater had stopped to help them raise their cabin wall and witnessed their filing. "This journal has been in my sole possession since my husband's death 2 years ago," she said. It was written contemporaneously, dated in his own hand, describing this land in detail no forger drawing up a false survey 11 years after the fact could possibly know, because he never set foot on it. I have proven up this claim for 5 years exactly as the law requires, through flood and through loss, and through a hard season, no easier than any that came before it. And I do not intend to hand it over to a company that could not even be bothered to forge its lies convincingly. A ripple of approving murmurs, even a scattering of applause quickly hushed by the commissioner's gavel, ran through the packed hall, and Voss's lawyer, seeing the room's sympathy turning firmly against his client, attempted one final argument about the survey grant's precedents, but Commissioner Whitmarsh had clearly heard enough. "I have examined the documents submitted by the Cascade Land Company," he said, "and I find the paper and ink inconsistent with the claimed date of origin, as testified by a land office clerk with over a decade of relevant experience. I have heard testimony establishing that the witness to the original 1883 filing had his full civil rights restored 2 years prior to signing, rendering the company's objection on that ground without legal merit. And I have heard from Mrs. Bell direct, contemporaneous, and highly specific evidence of continuous proof of claim, spanning the full statutory period." He looked at Voss with an expression that had gone entirely cold. "It is the finding of this hearing that the homestead patent for the northeast quarter section, and by clear extension the remaining claims of the Talus Valley homesteaders represented here today, stand valid and unencumbered. The Cascade Land Company's filed grant is rejected as fraudulent, and I am referring the matter to the territorial prosecutor for further investigation into forgery and the use of hired intimidation against lawful claimants." The hall broke into open applause this time, no gavel able to hush it, and Voss rose from his seat with his face gone dark and furious, casting one last look at Reuben before he pushed his way out through the crowd, his lawyer trailing after him. And that was the last that the Talus Valley ever saw of Silas Voss or the Cascade Land Company's ambitions in that particular corner of Washington territory. Amos Whitfield reached Ellisport with the herd 2 days later, having sold what stock the market would bear at a fair price, once word spread that the valley's claims had been confirmed, and there was a rough, joyful celebration that night in the yard behind the boarding house, homesteaders and townsfolk mingling over a fire and a fiddle someone had produced from a saddlebag. And it was there, under a sky finally, after weeks and weeks of rain, showing clear stars between breaking clouds, that Reuben Slater took Evelyn Bell's hands in both of his own and asked her, in front of the whole gathered valley, if she would consider becoming his wife. "I have very little to offer a woman like you," he said, echoing what he had told her by the river days before, though his voice was steadier now, sure of itself in a way it had not quite been then. "A hired man's savings, a name I built out of my own hard choosing, and a past that will probably follow me in whispers for the rest of my life, no matter how much good I try to do to answer it. But I love you more completely than I knew it was possible to love anyone, and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that love, if you will let me." "You have already proven it," Evelyn said, her eyes bright in the firelight, "at a river crossing and in a canyon and in 100 small quiet ways before either of those. I do not need you to have more to offer, Reuben. I need you exactly as you are, which is the bravest, gentlest, most honest man I have ever known. Yes, I will marry you." The gathered crowd cheered loud enough to startle the horses, and Amos Whitfield produced from somewhere a bottle of good whiskey he had apparently been saving for exactly this occasion, and even big Ned Calloway, gruff to the last, allowed that he supposed Reuben Slater had turned out to be as fine a man as the valley was likely to find, present company excepted, and bought the happy couple their first round himself. They rode back into the Talus Valley a week later, once the roads had dried enough to travel with reasonable ease, at the head of a herd considerably lighter but with pockets considerably heavier, and with a signed and sealed land patent, finally and permanently secured, tucked safe in Evelyn's saddlebag alongside her husband's old journal, which she intended to keep always, not as a wound reopened but as a record of the man who had first loved this land, and had, in his own quiet way, helped point them both toward the crossing that saved it. They were married in October, once the last of the harvest was in the small church at Cedar Home with the whole valley in attendance, Pemberton standing witness alongside Amos Whitfield. And Evelyn wore her mother's old blue dress and Reuben wore a borrowed coat that fit him poorly and did not care in the slightest. And when the minister asked if anyone present objected to the union, the only sound in the church was Big Ned Calloway, loudly clearing his throat in what everyone understood to be his particular way of showing approval. They built a second room onto the cabin that winter, working together in the brief windows of clear weather the Cascade rains allowed. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the fire was banked low and warm, they would sit together and talk, easily, about small things and large ones, the way people talk who have decided, fully and finally, to stop being alone in the world. The valley prospered in the years that followed, its claims secure, its river crossed and known now by every drover who came through, marked plainly on the maps as the ford that Evelyn Bell had found when every man around her could only argue about the danger of the water. She never stopped running her own herd, never became less than the equal partner in everything she and Reuben built together, and he never once tried to make her smaller than she was, content instead to stand beside her, steady and devoted, exactly as he had promised at a fireside by a flooded river, on the night everything between them had finally, fully, become clear. And on quiet evenings, when new settlers passing through the valley asked how the Bell homestead had survived the hard, rainy year the land company had tried to take it, the old-timers around Cedar Home would tell it the same way every time, with the same quiet pride. That the cattle drive had stalled at the river, and every man there had argued about what to do, and it was Evelyn Bell who rode out alone and found the crossing, and it was Evelyn Bell and the man who loved her who had carried the whole valley safely to the other side.